Okay, hello everybody. On behalf of Space, welcome and thanks for joining us for this panel on urban sprawl and sustainability, whereby you'll hear from 3 Concordia students discussing the issues of urban sprawl in general and the cases of Canada and Europe in particular. This is the very last panel of the very last day of Sustainability and the Climate Crisis residency at Space, brought to you by the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability and the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. So those of you who have joined us throughout the week, thanks so much for coming and coming back again. We really appreciate seeing you here this afternoon. If you're unfamiliar with Concordia University's Force Space, we are located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Indigenous land. We are a university-wide platform focused on working collaboratively with our community across the disciplines. Can't speak this afternoon, to activate research, teaching, and initiatives via process-based explorations. We are also currently recording the session and live streaming at CU Force Space on Facebook. I'll pop those links into the chat in a minute for you to share if you like. So you will hear 3 presentations. There will be moments for point of clarification questions, and then afterwards we will go into a gallery view and have a Q&A discussion with some special guests here behind the scenes as well, who'll be introduced in a minute. And you're more than welcome to add to that conversation. So what we suggest is that you either raise your little virtual hand and we'll be happy to unmute you so that you can speak and share your thoughts or questions that way. Or otherwise, there's the trusty Q&A box if you're more of a texter and you'd like to pop your question in there. It'll be addressed by our moderator, Rebecca Titler, who I'm passing proceedings off to now. Hi, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thank you to the whole team at Force Space. Doug and Anna have been amazing through this whole week of discussions, and we would be nowhere without them. So thank you. I'd like to start today by echoing a little bit of what Anna said about us being in Montreal, Tiohtià:ke, which is the unceded land of the Ganagahaga of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. According to my sources, Tiohtià:ke is in Quebec. In Quebec, the most Indigenous peoples were not allowed to vote until 1969, and the last residential school closed in Quebec, according to my sources, in 1979. So it's really important that we recognize this history here today and always. Tiohtià:ke means where the 2 part ways. This is a reference to the 2 communities of Kahnawake and Kanesatake that are still strong in the area to this day. Tiohtià:ke remains a meeting place for those of many nations and viewpoints, and we will be discussing some of those different viewpoints today. With that, I would like to welcome our panelists today on behalf of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center and the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability. Thank you all for being here. We have Mirya Reid, who will speak first. Mirya is doing an honors project, completing her undergraduate degree in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment under the supervision of Professor Jochen Jäger. And then we have Danielle Douez, who is doing an MA degree in the Department of Philosophy under the supervision of Dr. Jing Hu. And then we have Parnian Pourtaherian, who will present last, who is doing an MSc in the Geography Department, Geography, Planning and Environment, again, under the supervision of Professor Jochen Jäger. We also have Professor Jochen Jäger from the Geography Department and Professor Matthias Frisch from the Philosophy Department. And the reason that we have them here today is not only because, Professor Jäger is supervising some of these students, but because the work that our students are presenting today is part of a larger collaborative project that we are working on urban sprawl in Montreal, which involves Matthias Frisch, who is also here from the Philosophy Department, also Craig Townsend from Geography, Planning and Environment, and Professor Bill Bukowski from the Psychology Department. So I welcome you all, and with that, Mirya, I will invite you to share your screen and begin with the first presentation.
Okay. Can everybody see that? Okay, so hello everyone, my name is Mirya Reid and I'll be presenting my undergraduate honors project, Sharing Montreal with the Future. How concerned are Montrealers today about the implications of their residential choices on future generations? Urban sprawl is generally characterized by dispersed low-density urban development, segregated land uses, low connectivity, and automobile dependency. In Montreal, urban sprawl has been increasing continuously since the 1950s. This is problematic because sprawl is also associated with long-term consequences related to health and well-being, loss of agricultural land and natural open spaces, and its contributions to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. People are becoming increasingly aware of the impact of their actions on the environment, but as evidence from increasing trends of urban sprawl and preferences for suburban lifestyles, this may not be particularly reflected in people's residential choices. To explore this further, I examined Montrealers' perceptions and preferences of urban growth to better understand how these can change when future generations and the environment are explicitly considered. I hypothesized that there's a gap in general public knowledge about the long-term effects of urban sprawl, and that being made explicitly aware of these effects could influence individuals' residential preferences. To test this, we administered a stated preference survey to the Concordia University community and collected 168 responses. The survey was around 40 questions long, and to gauge respondents' residential preferences, we presented them with 5 hypothetical housing options ranging from most suburban to most urban. To get an idea of how their preferences might change, we asked them to choose from these options 3 different times and from 3 different perspectives. First, we asked them to choose from what they would prefer as a 30-year-old. Then they watched 2 informational videos about urban development in Montreal and intergenerational justice. After the videos, we asked them to state their preferences again as a 70-year-old and to make recommendations for a future 30-year-old in 2070. These were the options they were given each time. Data analysis was conducted in R, and I used chi-square tests to test for statistically significant associations and Pearson's R to determine whether the associations were positive or negative and how strong they were. When we asked for respondents' residential preferences at age 30 and age 70, the second housing option was the most popular for both. Since the options go from most suburban to most urban, option 2 is the second most suburban option. When making recommendations for a future 30-year-old in 2070, the most popular choice became option 4, which is the second most urban option. This might indicate that right now, people might still be leaning towards having larger, more suburban houses themselves, and it's easier for them to recommend a smaller, more urban option to a hypothetical 30-year-old in the future. To test whether or not there's a gap in knowledge surrounding the effects of sprawl, we simply asked respondents how familiar they were with it. And by and large, people were not very familiar with urban sprawl. Up to 30% stated they'd never heard of it before, compared to 10% who were very familiar. While that might sound discouraging, I think it might actually have made the results from my next hypothesis much more interesting. So to test whether being made explicitly aware of the effects of sprawl had any influence on respondents' residential preferences, we asked them about their perceptions of sprawl before and after watching a video about urban development in Montreal, which also briefly explained what urban sprawl is, and then compared how the perceptions of sprawl before and after watching the video were associated with their residential preferences. So it's kind of better that so many people in our sample didn't know that much about sprawl before the survey, because it meant we could compare their responses knowing we had given many of them new information. In this table is all of the questions we used to ask respondents about their perceptions of sprawl before watching the video. They're mostly statements that respondents could rate from 1 to 7, whether they strongly agreed to, strongly disagreed to. On the right are all the statistically significant associations between respondents' perceptions of sprawl and their residential preferences. When we asked about their preferences, we also asked how important various considerations, like wanting to minimize driving, were for making their decision. For example, at age 30, the wanting to minimize driving housing consideration was statistically significantly associated with the statement, urban sprawl is problematic for the environment, which means that the greater importance respondents gave to the minimized driving consideration, the more strongly they agree that urban sprawl is problematic for the environment. So I recorded how many statistically significant associations occurred for age 30, age 70, and recommendations for a 30-year-old in 2070. And as you can see, before watching the video about urban development, there were a lot more associations between respondents' perceptions of sprawl and their residential preferences at age 30 than for the two more futures-oriented scenarios. I thought this might be indicating that respondents' residential choices were just not that associated or influenced by their perceptions of sprawl when looking to the future. But then I tested it again once their perceptions of sprawl had been informed by the video. And that is what is illustrated here. So it's the same thing. These are the questions about their perceptions of sprawl after watching the video. And these are their residential preferences again. So here there's a negative association between the lots of living space and large house consideration, and the statement little to no public transit. So the greater importance people gave to the lots of living space consideration, the less they thought little to no public transit as an effective sprawl was problematic. Which is interesting in and of itself, but the point is that now after watching the video, the numbers of statistically significant associations have completely switched. Now the number of associations between respondents' residential preferences for the futures-oriented scenarios has increased significantly once their perceptions of sprawl have been informed by the video, and respondents have a better understanding about the effects of sprawl. My mouth is so dry. Sorry. So without having to look at all of the associations, this is how they changed before and after watching the video about urban development. Before the video, there were 17 statistically significant associations between respondents' perceptions of sprawl and residential preferences at age 30, and only 6 and 9 at age 70 in recommendations for a 30-year-old. After respondents' perceptions of sprawl had been informed by the video, there were significantly more associations with residential preferences for both of the futures-oriented scenarios. This implies that to a certain extent, respondents' residential preferences can be influenced by their perceptions of sprawl, and changing their perceptions by making them more informed about the issue has an effect on their residential choices. It should be noted that residential preferences at age 30 were measured before watching the video, and the futures-oriented scenarios were measured after. So these columns here are referring to when their perceptions of sprawl were measured before and after the video. So what's more important is how these increased, but the fact that these decreased is kind of arbitrary. So in summary, within our sample, there's definitely a gap in knowledge regarding what urban sprawl is and consequently its long-term effects. However, this allowed me to get a better idea of how respondents' residential preferences might be influenced by changes in their perceptions of sprawl before and after becoming more aware of the issue. After respondents' perceptions of sprawl were informed by the video about urban development in Montreal, there were significantly more associations between those perceptions and their stated preferences at age 70 and recommendations for a 30-year-old in 2070 than there were between their perceptions of sprawl before watching the video. This implies that greater awareness about its effects might also increase the influence that perceptions of sprawl have on individuals' residential preferences when looking to the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mirya. You can stop sharing your screen and we will take, if anybody has any quick points of clarification for Mirya, we can take those now. If you have a more detailed question, we might save it for the end of the 3 presentations. So just points of clarification now, if anybody has any. Anyone on the panel as well is welcome to ask for clarification on any point. Okay, if we're all clear, great presentation, Mirya, thank you so much. I will welcome Danielle. Danielle, do you want to share your screen and unmute yourself, and you can go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me? Are you seeing my screen? Can you see my presentation? I can't tell. Okay,
it looks great.
Wonderful. So thank you. I'm going to offer a bit more context around the concept of intergenerational justice. I am in the philosophy department, and so I'd like to make this connection between the concept and urban sprawl. So let's jump in. So I used to work in journalism, and I was covering a number of social issues in the US. And a major theme that I started to pick up on is this idea that no matter what the issue we're talking about, there's this idea that a generation can be held responsible for some problem. And it tends to look, I think, a lot like this. You may feel this generational tension playing out from time to time in your own family. And one area where I think this generational tension is particularly palpable is climate change. And I think that should come as no surprise because the time scale over which climate change occurs is longer than any one single generation or single lifetime. So this kind of relatively slow onset of incremental but now accelerating changes is what we might call a creeping problem. So these days, legions of young people are out on the streets and they're sending a distinct political message that has this kind of generational overtone. And it goes something like, well, we, the future generations, demand that you older generations act on behalf of our future. And so in 2016, we get this iconic image from the United Nations with the former US Secretary of State, John Kerry, holding his granddaughter in one arm and signing the US into the Paris Climate Agreement with the other. We all know what else happened in 2016. Donald Trump was elected, we left the agreement, etc. My point here is not about politics, but I just want to present this case as evidence that perhaps intuitively we feel an obligation to the future. And I like to think that when you start talking about moral obligations, you call up your favorite philosopher and start asking for advice. And so as it is with parties, when I go, I just want to present a simple question for you all today. And so that question is, should the same logic of generational responsibility, which in the philosophical literature is called intergenerational justice, should this apply to the problem of urban sprawl? Before we can jump to the case of urban sprawl, I want to clarify how this concept is discussed in the literature and philosophy, and distinguish it a bit from perhaps how it's discussed in the popular discourse. And I just want to go over three main ideas that you should keep in mind. So the first is building on this intuition in the case that I just presented. And I think we can roughly outline a more formal logic that might be at play. So this is what I'm going to present with you is just one way of thinking about it. And it goes something like this. So we start from this idea of inheritance, the idea that we inherit a world from past generations that makes our life possible. Then you might also say, well, we're mortal beings and eventually we're going to pass on, and whatever world we leave behind, the future generation will inherit. So if you agree with these two ideas, you might also be led to conclude, well, what should we do? You might think present generations actually have some kind of obligation to pass on a world where future generations that is in as good or better condition. This is just a rough sketch of what that outline of that logic might look like, but if you are interested in a more detailed account, Dr. Fritsch has written a book, Taking Turns with the Earth. I'm sure he can speak more to it later in our discussion. So moving on to the second idea that I think we should clarify is who we're talking about when we're talking about present and future generations. So based on this meme, roughly we might be tempted to think that Generation Z is the quote unquote future generation for whom we're acting. But it turns out if we keep thinking about who we're talking about, there are many more distant generations that will be affected when it comes to creeping problems like climate change or urban sprawl. And so we get this idea, what's often referred to as non-overlapping generations. So these are generations that are not yet born, with whom we will never overlap in our lifetime. So philosophers of intergenerational justice are divided on whether or not it's possible to anticipate what their needs might be. It seems that perhaps they're just too distant in the future. There's no way we can imagine what they need. And so the conclusion is, well, we can't possibly be held responsible for providing for them. So keep this problem in mind as we move on to the third idea. And that has to do with the question of what we're passing on in this relationship of reciprocity. So for a long time, philosophers have been thinking about social justice using a model of distribution, distributing goods and burdens in a society in a fair way. And the metaphor that's often used that you might be familiar with is the idea of distributing pieces of a pie or a cake. But when it comes to future generations, especially non-overlapping generations, this model kind of falls apart. I think it's hard to think about what portion we should distribute of some good to someone who's not here yet. And it also doesn't quite make sense when we're dealing with objects that cannot easily be divided, such as the earth in the case of climate, or a city in the case of urban sprawl. There's something about the object as a whole that makes it valuable in these cases. And so we might think of another model, which is based on turn taking. So anyone who's lived in a major city may have experienced a bike share program. You receive a bike that's been used by someone else, you use it for your purposes, and you know that someone's going to be using it after you. And so you may not be able to anticipate all of their needs, how tall or short they may be to adjust the seat. You do make sure to some extent that it's in good working condition for the next person to be able to take their turn. So we've got these three main ideas that I wanted to bring about intergenerational justice. And so I'd like to return to the original simple question that I posed. Should intergenerational justice apply to the problem of urban sprawl? And I think that so far, at least as the theory goes, the answer is yes, but what about in practice? And so this is why I'm excited to be collaborating with the geography department and their researchers to see what we can find out based on the survey data. So in the survey that Mirya was just discussing, we did ask a number of questions about perceptions of the future or attitudes towards the future. To what extent are your living choices motivated by concern for the future? So I just want to share a couple of things that we found. And the first is when we asked people, to what extent do you agree with the statement that I'm worried about the effects that urban sprawl may have on future generations? The majority didn't have a strong opinion. They were pretty meh. So this is before we showed an educational video in which we explained some of the concepts that I've just gone over. So then after showing them this educational video where we explain about what intergenerational justice is, we asked them, to what extent do you agree with this statement that I care a lot now about the living conditions of future generations? As you can see, a majority strongly agree, which I think is interesting. And so there's a question about the role of education in these considerations. So both in theory and some preliminary evidence suggests that I think the answer is yes. Intergenerational justice is a very helpful way for thinking about the problem of urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is precisely this kind of creeping problem where intergenerational justice is especially relevant. And this model of justice over generations is well suited to the scale of the problem. So all of this leaves me with a few more questions that I'd love to perhaps get into during the discussion. So how could educating people about intergenerational justice transform the way we think about social justice more broadly? What other contexts might be inspired to apply this model as a result? And I'm particularly interested in finding out how can philosophers and non-philosophers collaborate more fruitfully? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Does anybody have any points of clarification for Danielle before we move on? Again, if you have more detailed questions, please save them for the end. Okay, very clear, obviously, Danielle. Our last presenter is Parnian Pourtaherian. So Parnian, I will invite you to share your screen and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Rebecca. Can you hear me? So I'm Parnian. Hello, everyone. And I'm going to talk about the effects of greenbelts on urban sprawl in European cities. So nowadays, the fast and uncontrolled expansion of urban areas around the world is very controversial regarding its detrimental consequences, particularly environmental impacts, from energy inefficiencies to disruption of ecosystems and habitat fragmentation. Urban sprawl generally refers to dispersed low-density development on undeveloped land, which follows unsustainable trends. It has 3 dimensions, and in general, urban sprawl is higher when the amount of built-up areas in a landscape, which is presented in red, increase and they become more dispersed, and the utilization density becomes lower. The United Nations have claimed that in 2018, Europe has been among the most urbanized regions in the world, with 74% of the population living in urban areas. And a multi-scale analysis of urban sprawl in Europe has shown that an extensive part of it is affected by urban sprawl. In some countries, one of the policies to prevent urban sprawl and to stop the permeation of built-up areas into the landscape is the use of green belts around the cities or regions. Greenbelt is a perpetual open space, such as a forest or a farmland, which is planned to restrict extensive urban growth, and its main and development on it is illegal or strictly regulated. The Greenbelt initiative originated from Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities idea and was first applied around London in 1930s. But the effectiveness of Greenbelts is subject to controversy, and there are opposing arguments that greenbelts can both limit and contribute to urban sprawl. So what I'm trying to do is to provide a comprehensive view on the functionality of greenbelts. So this study focuses on 60 cities and greater cities within 13 European countries, 30 of which have greenbelts and 30 not. The cities were selected by identifying 30 European cities with greenbelts and dividing them into 4 population size categories. Then, according to these categories, cities without greenbelts were selected correspondingly so that an equal distribution of the cities with and without greenbelt are available for a balanced comparison. The minimum population of the cities selected was approximately 100,000 people. This chart illustrates the equal distribution of the case studies regarding their population size. First group is the cities with greenbelts, and the second group is the ones without them. And the cities are divided into 4 population size categories. So how do we measure urban sprawl? I used 2 main metrics for the measurement of urban sprawl: weighted urban proliferation, or WUP, and weighted sprawl per capita, or WSPC. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to go over them in details, but in general, the WUP method is based on the understanding that when the built-up areas in a landscape increase and they become more dispersed, and the uptake of built-up areas per inhabitant or job becomes higher, in other words, the utilization density becomes lower, the degree of urban sprawl increases. Weighted sprawl per capita shows how much each person contributes to urban sprawl on average. So while WUP denotes how much sprawl exists in 1 square meter of landscape, WSPC shows how much urban sprawl is generated on average by each person. In this study, according to the outcomes, WUP values range between 0 and 20 urban permeation units per square meter of landscape, and WSPC values vary between 0 and 12,000 urban permeation units per inhabitant or job. To simplify and accelerate the process of calculating WUP and its components, the Urban Sprawl Metrics, or USM toolset, was developed, which is a geographic information system toolset that can be used in ArcGIS. Here are the data that were used in this study. The information about the built-up areas for 2006 and 2015, the population data for each city, the total number of jobs for each city, and the information needed to convert the part-time jobs into their full-time equivalents, the boundaries of cities corresponding to population and jobs, and the shapefiles or maps of greenbelts, as many as possible. To make it more visually perceptible, I brought the maps of built-up areas and greenbelt of Vienna as an example for the reference years of 2006 and 2015 and their corresponding information. Despite the increase in population and area of built-up areas from 2006 to 2015, the results show decreases in both WSBC and group from between these 2 years in this specific case. So here are all of the results. This chart shows the relative changes in WSBC or weighted sprawl per capita for all the case studies that is expressed in percentages. This is showing how much the contribution of each person to urban sprawl has changed from 2006 to 2015. The cities with green belts are presented in green and the ones without green belts are displayed in red. According to these outcomes, WSBC has decreased in 26 of the total of 30 cities with green belts, which is almost 87% of this group. This proportion is more than twice that of the cities without green belts, whose WSBC decreased. Statistical analysis on these results of WSBC indicate that there is a significant difference between the means of the two groups and also the medians. As you can see in this second chart, the mean for WSBC relative changes in cities without green belts is almost 25%, and it's minus 26% for cities with green belts, meaning that urban sprawl, or the contribution of each person to urban sprawl on average increased by 25% in cities without green belts, while it decreased by 26% in cities with green belts. The medians are also in opposite directions. The median is 5% for cities without green belts, and it's minus 24% for cities with green belts. The statistical analysis also showed that among all the cities where WSBC diminished, the decrease was stronger in cities with green belts. Here are the results for relative changes in ROOP, or weighted urban proliferation, that is showing how much urban sprawl in 1 square meter of landscape has changed between these 2 years. Here we also have decrease in the relative value of ROOP in 26 cities, or 87% of the cities with green belts. This proportion is 37% for the cities without green belts, which is in 10 cities in this category. And the statistical analysis again proves the difference between the means and also medians of the two groups. So here the two groups of cities are again showing different responses. The mean for ROOP relative changes in cities without green belts is almost 30%, and it is minus 22% for the cities with green belts. It means that on average, urban sprawl in 1 square meter of landscape in cities without green belts has increased by 30%, while it has decreased in the cities with green belts by 22%. Again, the medians are in opposite directions, 6% for cities without green belts and minus 18% for cities with green belts. Same as relative decreases in WSBC, among all the cities where ROOP decreased, the relative decrease is significantly stronger in cities with green belts. So to recap, here are the highlights and the most important findings of this study. This study is actually the first study that assesses the effectiveness of green belts at curbing urban sprawl by comparing a considerable number of cities with and without green belts. Green belts have been effective in slowing down urban sprawl. In most cases, they also have helped reduce it. While urban sprawl has decreased even in some cities without green belts, the relative decrease in urban sprawl has been stronger in cities with green belts. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Parnian. Does anybody have any questions off the bat for Parnian? I do. So I thank you for this really great study. And I've always wondered, you know, do green belts actually help or not? And I know that there's controversy. I'm just wondering, it's great that you've done it for Europe. I think of European cities as being designed in a different way from North American cities. So being designed for horse transport, or much more for travel on foot. And I'm wondering if you think you would expect to find the same kind of results for North America, if you have any plans to continue to look at North American cities, or if you think that that these results might be different. Is this something that's worth looking at?
Thank you for your question, Rebecca. Of course, I'm very interested in continuing this research and for all the other case studies. So from what I've done, now I'm 100% sure that for the European cities, the Greenbelt Initiative was actually effective. And I assume that although the different countries and different continents have different planning regulations for the Greenbelts, but in general, because of the main purpose that they all have and they're in common with, I assume that they all work in the same way and they're effective in controlling urban sprawl. The reason why I selected Europe was that, well, Europe is one of the greenest continents, and most of the cities with greenbelts are actually located in Europe. And so I needed a big enough sample size to be able to actually statistically test this and prove this statement, because as many of the authors argued, some believe that greenbelts can actually lead to urban sprawl because of the accelerated development inside the greenbelt itself or beyond it. So it is actually true in some cases. In some of the results that I found, well, there were 3 specific cases that despite having greenbelts, urban sprawl increased in them. So it's not something that you can say it works the same for all the cities with greenbelts, but in general, it is expected that for more than 80% of the cities with greenbelts, it works the same way and it's effective.
Thank you, Parnian. I guess I could ask maybe Mirya and Danielle the same question. Do you think your results would differ if we were in Europe?
I don't know. It would definitely be interesting to look at, because I think that, well, a lot of the survey is looking at perceptions of urban sprawl. So I would wonder if, like, in a completely different sort of education system, that perceptions would be different, and that might also lead to different residential preferences. It's very possible. I don't know if it would. I feel like it would be more relevant maybe than in North America.
Danielle, what about you?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good sense of whether it would be significantly different, especially for the question of intergenerational justice. I'm trying to think of like what cultural factors may mediate that. I'm not sure, but it's interesting. It would be certainly interesting to compare across cultures.
Yeah. All right, I have a question in the Q&A, which is from Ray Tamalti. A question for Parnian specifically. Did you look at growth rates in the various cities? Is it possible that the cities with green belts are slower growing and therefore have lower sprawl?
This is actually one of the hypotheses that I'm going to look into. I still haven't done that, but I have definitely taken into account the populations for 2006 and 2015 separately, and I'm going to work on that. Yes, it is assumed that in the cities with green belts, the rate of the increase in urban sprawl would be slower. But the interesting results was that they actually showed a different response. The urban sprawl didn't increase in them, it actually decreased. So I still need to look at that rate to see with what rates they actually decreased. But the first assumption was that urban sprawl has occurred in all the cities, has increased, and it was slower in the cities with green belts.
Right, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I would remind you, please put them in the Q&A. If at all possible, I will keep track of the chat as well, but it's much easier for us to moderate if we see things in the Q&A. And also I'll invite our panelists also to ask questions if they have any questions for each other. Danielle, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a clarifying question for Parnian, because I'm not familiar with this measure that you were talking about, the WSPC. I wonder if you could just break that down and describe how you measured that.
Yes, sure. I can share my screen again. I have a supplementary slide for that. So, sorry. So here I have brought the full formulas as to how we calculate urban sprawl. So the WOOP value is calculated using the percentage of built-up areas, dispersion of them, and land uptake per person. And for weighted sprawl per capita, what we take into account is the area of the reporting unit. We multiply it by the WOOP value and divide it by the number of inhabitants and jobs. So it basically—
Parnian, sorry, can you go full screen so we can see a little clearer? Sorry.
Yes, sure. Sorry.
Thank you.
So yeah, by dividing it in by number of inhabitants and jobs, we are actually taking into account the contribution of each person to urban sprawl, which is not dependent on the size of the city or the extra elements that can be effective in urban sprawl actually.
And the land,
Yes, sorry.
the land uptake per person is measured by what?
Land uptake per person is the area each individual occupies. So it's so we divide the area of the whole built-up areas by the number of inhabitants and jobs. So
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, if I may jump in, if somebody's interested, please send an email either to Parnian or to me. We would be happy to send you the paper where all the details are described. It has been published a while ago and it's all available. So if anybody's interested, they can download the tool and do their urban sprawl calculations themselves as well.
Thank you. And if you have a link for that, I can pop it in the chat, but if not, you can just contact Professor Yeager. I'll put his email in the chat for people if they need it. Does anybody else have any questions, other questions or concerns or comments? Otherwise, I have one, but it's not really fair for you, Mirya. So I'll let somebody else jump in if they have one. We have one in the Q&A, which is a question for Danielle and Mirya. You both used an intervention research model where you explored how watching a video affects responses to questions about sprawl. You found strong impacts, but it's well known that this type of effect often diminishes over time. Do you think this would happen in your case? Good question. Thank you, Ray Tamalti.
Well, this survey is kind of a preliminary study to see, like, okay, if we did this, what would happen in general? And so our indicators aren't completely perfect, I guess, but we thought that there was enough of a difference that it was worth noting, I think.
Thank you, Mirya. Danielle, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And I wonder, I've been thinking about whether there's a difference in the intervention effect for urban sprawl versus intergenerational justice. To my mind, like urban sprawl may be the kind of issue that is not necessarily at a level of like public knowledge that we might expect, or like people don't know about it as much. Whereas for the case of intergenerational justice, and as I was trying to kind of make the point in my presentation, there's at least some evidence that intuitive that we have this kind of obligation to future generations. So I'm not sure if the impact of this kind of educational video is as substantial as we might see despite what we're seeing in the data.
So it would be maybe worth doing a follow-up study that would look at, you know, the effects over time,
Yeah.
if we were interested in that question. Yeah. Matthias, did you have something to add or a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what what I want to say in some sense follows up on this. I would say it seems to me that there is a difference here between the two videos. While video one educates the respondents about urban sprawl, the second educates them about intergenerational justice, but just offers some models and doesn't actually lead them in a certain way. You know, it doesn't say, look, you know, what's happening in Montreal is bad for future people or anything like that. It offers various models as to how to think about what obligations we might have to future people, including the turn taking that Danielle talked about. And it seems to me then, nonetheless, you might say that, well, there is a diminishing of this kind of effect over time, and I suppose that's quite likely. You know, people are impressed when they see what urban sprawl actually is, how it has affected Montreal, and when they're explicitly asked to reflect on what this means for future Montrealers, then there is a certain kind of sympathy effect that may be generated thereby. But one can also say that, yes, but it also tells us something. It tells us, and this is actually what I wanted to ask Mirya and Danielle perhaps to elaborate on. What it tells us is that one finding seems to be, in both of these cases, that education is very important. You know, when people, many people don't seem to know about urban sprawl, and when they're told about it, then they become concerned about it, right? To a certain degree, not everybody, and then it's interesting to to ask, well, what exactly is the concern? And similarly, when it comes to their relationship to future people, so especially the moral, political, social obligations that we might have to future people. It seems kind of diffuse. We may have that intuition, but it may seem somewhat diffuse. But when you talk about it and you offer some models as to how to think about it, and then did this, talking about reciprocity, talking about the turn-taking model, and so on, then it seems that people care more. Right, and so education perhaps could offset this diminishing effect that was mentioned in the question. And Mirya, Danielle, do you want to add something to that? And do you think that's true? I mean, this is an overall outcome of the study so far.
I think that in general, what we're kind of trying to say is that everyone knows that you should recycle, and everyone knows about plastic straws and sea turtles and stuff, but people don't really know about urban sprawl in such a widespread way at all. And they definitely don't know how the type of house that they choose has some kind of environmental impact like littering does, that everybody knows about. And so what we're looking at is what does that mean when we tell people that this is a thing and your housing choices matter like all your other choices, like ethical clothing shopping and buying organic food. So we're just like very preliminarily asking what people think about that once they know about it at all.
Yeah, I think so. At least so far as the results we have suggest, care for future generations increases after this kind of intervention. At least it seems that's the case. Then obviously the question is there action that follows, right? That we would be interested, I think perhaps even more interested in further investigating. And then I guess my other question, and I'd be interested to hear perhaps people in urban sprawl who've been working on this longer, is the idea of going to the level of the consumer as the point of intervention, and like why we think that makes sense, as opposed to perhaps at the level of policymaking or regulation. I mean, obviously consumers have a huge role to play, but I'm just curious how this might look in different levels of intervention.
I'd be happy to say something in response, Rebecca. I don't think that the survey's results were, or the setup of the survey was primarily intended to have some kind of an effect on the consumer, that is, on the person who might buy a house. I mean, we asked about that in order to trigger certain kinds of intuitions and certain kinds of preferences, to see whether preferences are at before the video, after the video, about urban sprawl and so on. But that this is just to trigger where people are at, as it were, but it wasn't meant to prejudge any possible recommendations that could come out of this. So, for example, a recommendation could very well be that, look, there should be more education about urban sprawl. It's important for a city to be telling its citizens, how it is sprawling and what kind of long-term effects that has. I mean, it doesn't maybe show over a few years, but it shows over 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And Jochen knows this much better than I do, but I think this is one of the things that could be an outcome, and that is a policy outcome. We should be addressing this at the level of education, so people understand urban sprawl and its effect, and so that a democratically governing city can make informed choices about what it wants to be like, whether it wants to sprawl or not, and what kinds of effects that has on the environment, as well as on future inhabitants of that very city, as well as future inhabitants of the world in general. So it isn't prejudging the outcome. It isn't really from the beginning directed at the consumer, but could have policy implications, I would say. Jochen, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's many levels that are included here. As you said, the policy level is very important, the consumers as well, but of course the consumers can only choose from all the options that are offered. So the developers play a huge role here, and the developers are a lobby group, right? They're pushing policymaking in certain directions and away from other directions. So that's an important discussion to have. But if the population of a city, for example, doesn't even perceive a problem here, then of course nothing is going to change, right? Then the developers can just do whatever they do, and most of them are interested in profits and not in sustainability. So I think that's why this discussion is so urgently needed.
Thank you to both of you. I have another question in the Q&A from Katya Neves. I was wondering if the panelists might want to comment on the matter of educating policymakers and government on these matters. I'm thinking, for example, of Ford's attempt to move into the Greenbelt in Ontario. It sounds like Parnian, you should get on the phone with Doug Ford. Any comments? Do we have a responsibility there?
A huge one, of course, yes. I just don't want to take over too much, but that's a prime example of why sometimes green belts don't work, because if certain politicians don't think the rules apply to their decisions, then of course it won't work. And we've seen this in other cases as well among politicians. So rules apply to everyone, including politicians, and that's very important. And I think Parnian's results are very striking, because so far there has always been this discussion pro and contra green belts. And if that's in limbo there, people may not push for green belts. But with Parnian's results, one can really go ahead and say, let's put green belts wherever possible and take them seriously, and tell politicians like Doug Ford, that's a no-no. These rules apply to everybody. So I think this is a fantastic tool. It's not the only one. There are other important tools as well. But I think Parnian's results should really be highlighted. It's the first study that ever does a statistical comparison of cities with and without green belts. And yes, I wonder if there are enough cities in North America that have any serious green belts to even do such a study. Ottawa has one, Toronto has one, Montreal has little pieces or parts of it that are supposed to work as a green belt. But how many other cities are there in North America that have a green belt that's worth being called a green belt? I wonder.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be worth doing it even just in Ottawa and Toronto to see if those results, you know, fall into line with the results from Europe or not. Just because it's easy to say, well, that applies in Europe, but we have here, you know, a car-based planning model, and perhaps things are different. I just think of Ottawa with the, you know, the sprawl that is south of the Greenbelt, and I wonder, you know, right off the bat, if you would find the same thing for Doug Ford. I'm sure he's could easily say as well, well, that's Europe and this is North America. Anyways, anybody else want to comment on that?
I had a question about green belts and perhaps how it might be tied to thinking about future generations. My experience, I lived in Atlanta for 10 years and they're doing this belt line that's a 22-mile loop around the city of green space, trails, etc., and light rail. And part of the discussion there was, well, this project is planned for 25 years, if not more, given the financial undoing of the project. And so this kind of led to people to not be so excited about it, in fact, like vote against it, because it would not benefit them immediately. So I just kind of wonder how you think about this concept applying to Greenbelt issues.
Who are you asking? Somebody in particular? I'm not sure.
I was asking Parnian.
Okay.
So the problem with all these spatial planning thing is that they don't happen immediately. And the fact that people are actually thinking what benefits them at the moment. So, but, well, this is something that actually exists and we cannot do anything about it. The fact that we need to just, I think by educating people with all these results and just showing them these proofs that, and also the similar thing like the survey that you were working on, I think the best way of actually make that happen is to educate people. There's no more thing that I can think of at this moment. Maybe Dr. Yeager can elaborate more on this issue.
Maybe Matthias can say something. I don't know the case well enough to say much quite specific.
No, I don't know much about it either. I just want to say something in general. One of the findings, preliminary findings from the survey is also that one of the reasons to be concerned about the future, other than it's my future, I'm part of this future, seems to be a strong sense of community. So we in the survey divided the possible reasons that you might be concerned about urban sprawl in the future among 3 possible reasons. And one is, well, I'm included, you know, I will be older in 50 years, but I will be included, so it affects me. And 2 was, I care about the city itself. I care about the community that Montreal represents for me, and I feel myself to some extent a part of that, and I care about how that community will do in the future, whether I'm a part of it or not. And then thirdly, I care about future Montrealers, so other than me. So that's how we divided it. And it seemed that the first 2 were the most significant draw, and Mirya and Danielle looked at the data much more carefully than I did, and you can confirm that. But it seemed that the first 2, especially the second, was a significant draw, namely the sense that I care about Montreal as a community into the future. So when you want to get people on board with a green belt, even though it will have significant effects only in, I think the number that Danielle gave us was 25 years or so, and even if that costs money now, but the really beneficial effects will come on stream only in 20, 25 years or so. And one of the ways in which you can motivate that, it seems, is that you have a good sense of community, that people feel like I belong to Atlanta. I'm an Atlantean, is that how you say this? You know, I'm a Montrealer, and I care about the city. Even when I'm not there anymore, I care about how it's faring, how it's doing, right? And so I don't know what you would call this, you know, branding, but education, but you know, polishing the image in some way. Look, we are a community, and as long as we live here, you know, we're leaving a legacy for the future. We should care about that, simply because, you know, we're part of this. This is in some sense a community. Of course, an urban community is, you know, is also anonymous to some extent, but it's not just anonymous. And so that seems to me to be what one might think about here.
We need to wrap up. Thank you, Matthias. We need to wrap up, and we do have one question from an audience member. So Brogan, if you can unmute yourself if it's quick. Have a couple of minutes.
Sorry, I didn't realize it was wrapping up. Yeah, thank you so much. That was very interesting. I actually was just wondering kind of how this could relate to the COVID-19 pandemic, because I know some of my friends were looking for a place up north, and as soon as the pandemic started a year ago, prices just skyrocketed because everyone was looking for places out of town. Now that people don't have to come downtown to work and everything is remote, a lot more people are spreading out and wanting to live far away from people. So I was kind of curious if anyone knows how that's affected urban sprawl. And also particularly for Danielle, I was wondering, because having people live close together and in dense populations is really bad in terms of a pandemic. I was wondering if you've taken that into consideration with your study. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that would be a question for Mirya, because she has a question added to the survey, right?
Yeah, we did ask people at the end whether their perceptions of urban sprawl had changed since the pandemic. And I think 40% said yes, and 60% said no, they hadn't really thought about it, which makes sense since a lot of our sample had never heard of sprawl before. And there wasn't that much difference between those people who thought it was different and their residential choices. I know that there is like a lot of fear of density right now because of the pandemic. I think that income is a stronger indicator of transmission rates and cases than is density. And so I don't know, I mean, we're in the pandemic right now, so like we don't have, research about it is happening live. There's not solid results yet to say that it was because of density or whatever. I would like to think that there's a way that we can live in a not sprawling environment and not be afraid of stuff like the pandemic. But as more research comes out about that, it will be very interesting, I think.
Thank you, Mirya. Johan, did you have a final comment?
I would like to point out, yes, the interdisciplinary character of this project between philosophy and geography, and that this is exactly what the Loyola Research Center for Sustainability is all about, to work across the disciplinary boundaries. So I like that a lot, and I would like to encourage people to do that. Maybe if any one of the others people on the panel have a comment, share some experience, how they feel about it.
Well, it is one of the main goals of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center is to foster cross-disciplinary research and interdisciplinary research projects like this one, and also of the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability to foster a cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary approach to sustainability at a curricular level. So yes, we do support projects like this. Thank you for the plug, Jochen, or for allowing me to make the plug. With that, I'll have to thank all of our panelists today for your wonderful presentations, and Professor Frisch and Professor Yeager for your participation as well, and all of our audience for being here on a sunny Friday afternoon. And also, of course, ForSpace again for hosting us today. This is the second to last event in our week-long discussion on sustainability and the climate crisis. If you check the website where you found information about this, you will see recordings posted with a 24-hour delay of each of the events. So if you want to come back or rewatch or watch some stuff that you missed, or recommend some things with friends, there are links there. You can also check out ForSpace on Facebook and their YouTube channel if you want to share that way as well. With that, I will invite you all to come back at 2:30. And we will end our week of discussion with a fun event. We will play a climate Jeopardy game, so please do join us back here then. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Rebecca. And perhaps if you'll allow me, I'll just take a moment to thank the students and all the panelists here today. We were really impressed by the caliber of your presentations and really happy to kind of dedicate an hour for exactly this conversation. So thank you for being here and for all your research and work that you've done. It's been a real pleasure to have this moment with you. And perhaps since this is our official last penultimate event, I guess, Rebecca, this is our moment to also thank you for the tremendous amount of work that you've done for about a year or two now in preparing all of these events and all of the activities that happened over the entire week. It's been really a tremendous amount of work and a pleasure to work with you and see how incredibly organized you are and keeping everybody on top of their game. So thank you. Okay, folks, we're going to close up the webinar now, and hopefully we'll see you for Jeopardy. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend, and we look forward to seeing you at other ForSpace events. Check us out, concordia.ca/4. Stuff happening every day. Okay, bye.